This war is not as in the past. Whoever occupies a territory also imposes on it his own social system. Joseph Stalin, 1945. Hi everyone, this is Mr. Trio, and today we take a look at the last focus point in the chapter, Who Was to Blame for the Cold War? In some ways, as we look at the last focus point, who was more to blame for starting the Cold War, the USA or the USSR? This is a unit which is essentially a compilation of all the other focus points. So we will not really be focusing on new information, but essentially looking at the information in a different way. Let's go back to that measurement that I introduced in the very first video in this series. If we were to look at this question, who was more to blame for the Cold War, we could then say the Soviet Union was to blame. Or on the other spectrum, we could say the United States was to blame. Somewhere in the middle, we could say they were both to blame. And then I also put forth an idea that you could make the argument that neither was to blame. It was just a circumstance of the time. Certainly, as we have looked at the Greek Civil War, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Aid Program, the different events that led to the Berlin blockade, at different points you could definitely say, well, the Soviet Union was to blame for the blockade, but the United States was certainly responsible for making the issues more tense by creating a unified zone in the introduction of the Deutschmark. So, in order to be an effective student of history, one of the things that we need to do is to look at each of the different issues and use a matrix or a framework in order to better understand the different events. And that's what this focus point is all about. In some ways, Stalin can be looked at as an individual who was responsible for some things, but not others. And then in some ways, Truman can be seen as an individual who was responsible for some things, but not others. What I've done for this last focus point is to take all the information that we've learned so far and try to put it within a framework of 4 different big ideas, as I like to call them. The first is the issue of trust. The second is personality. The third is clash of ideologies. And last, an escalation. We're going to take a look at each of these 4 big ideas as it looks at the different events that make up this particular unit. As you know, there are lots of times that we look at the events in the post-war 1945 era, in which trust was the huge part of why the Soviet Union and the United States were at odds with each other. These are different issues that are important to follow along the way, and as you look at that matrix of who was more to blame, Truman or Stalin, you can look at the trust issues as it pertains to it. One thing that we've talked about a little bit is personality, but I want to take a little bit more time here to explore it further. When we look at Stalin as a personality, it cannot be underestimated that he was a ruthless leader, an individual who was responsible for millions of deaths in the Soviet Union. And it is also important to remember that he was a reactionary, an individual who would come back to a situation with very strong force when he felt that he was threatened. On the other hand, we have President Truman, who was making polar decisions. And what I mean by that is that Truman was an individual who saw things as right or wrong, black or white. He often had the inability to look at things in a more nuanced way, like Winston Churchill or President Roosevelt before him. He was an individual who was all in or all out. The other important thing about Truman, which kind of pertains to all of us, is that he was a student of history. He was fully aware of the events of the 1920s, the failures of the League of Nations, and as president, Truman wanted to make sure that the past would not be repeated, that the mistakes that the League had made in the 1920s and 30s would not be done again. We've talked about this concept of the clash of ideologies before, but just as another illustration, one of the big conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union is when their interests blend together. And when we look at Poland, Germany, Greece, and Berlin, certainly we see this Venn diagram coming together in which the United States and the Soviet Union have similar interests in these areas, and that this is where the greatest conflicts of the Cold War during the early period take place. How do Stalin and Truman react to these situations? Well, you may remember some of the concepts. Stalin put in troops in Eastern Europe, the rigged elections that he supported, the secret police. On the other hand, we can look at Truman and the money and the power of the Marshall Plan, or these concepts of containment. The thing that I'd like you to think about is that whether we're looking at Truman or Stalin, the way that they react is directly related to their ideology. How does a capitalist look at a problem and how they solve it? They throw money at it because that is their mindset. That's the whole idea behind the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Aid Program. How does a communist look at creating a solution? They look at creating a strong government which can control what they want. So, as we look at these conflicts, always try to keep in mind that at the heart of it, Truman and Stalin are being driven by what they believe in the way that they try to solve the problem. Now, we haven't really talked about this concept, but I'm going to introduce it here, and I hope that you can look at more examples in our textbook. In some ways, the problems of the Cold War often have to do with an escalation of events. For example, the United States created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in order to combat communism and specifically the Soviet Union. In return, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact in order to create an equal footing with NATO. The United States created Bizonia in order to create a unified government system in Western Germany. The Soviet Union created Cominform in order to create a communist system. This tit-for-tat idea of what the US was doing and the Soviet Union was reacting to is very important, because essentially when you have this back and forth, what it means is that the events are not solving each other, but essentially are making the situation worse and worse. Thanks so much for joining me as we look at this last focus point. Once again, I think one of the things that our textbook does very well is that they create these nice lists, and certainly you can, to some extent, memorize the different points on Stalin or memorize the different points on Truman. But without this proper framework, it's hard to make good analysis. So try to take this framework as we look at these different issues about who is more to blame, the USA or the USSR. Thanks so much for joining me on this video, and we'll talk more in class.